Recalling the brief fury in the Hall of Morning Flowers, Daniel Moore now realized it was jealousy. Had Charles King fallen for her? "I'll take her back. You should rest early, senior brother." Charles King's cold voice carried a clear reminder to Daniel Moore that the woman in his arms belonged to him. Daniel Moore watched Eleanor Bennet as she slept soundly, his heart tightening, followed by a sense of loss. With Charles King's domineering and icy nature, Eleanor Bennet could never truly be happy by his side. This thought deeply troubled him. Charles King heard that Daniel Moore did not leave the palace today and immediately knew the reason was Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore, who usually disliked the oppressive atmosphere of the palace, would have certainly left if not for her. Thinking of this, a sense of loss rose in his heart as he left the palace in frustration, unintentionally wandering to the Imperial Medical Institute. When he saw Eleanor Bennet and Daniel Moore happily drinking together, his heart was filled with jealousy. He carried Eleanor Bennet back to her room, placed her on the bed, but sat absent-mindedly beside her. Looking at her face, as delicate as a peach blossom, he still convinced himself that he was merely captivated by her uniqueness. How could he possibly fall for a woman? "Eleanor Bennet, don't drink like this again in the future." Charles King gently stroked her flushed cheeks and softly pulled the blanket over her. "Don't call me Eleanor Bennet. I am not Eleanor Bennet. How can I leave this place? I really want to go back." Eleanor Bennet mumbled, her eyes brimming with tears, as if she was deeply heartbroken even in her dreams. Hearing her words, Charles King was startled. "She's not Eleanor Bennet." He had once doubted it. A noble lady shouldn't possess such profound and peculiar medical skills. Yet, the investigation yielded no flaws. Could there truly be people in this world who look exactly alike? If she wasn't Eleanor Bennet, then her presence in the palace must have a hidden purpose. "Eleanor Bennet, no matter who you are, leaving this place is impossible." Charles King wiped away the tear at the corner of her eye and whispered a few words into her ear before leaving the room with a cold smile. He was certain Eleanor Bennet had her own secret motives. Leaving unscathed? Only if he allowed it. As Charles King stepped outside, he saw Daniel Moore standing in the courtyard, seemingly waiting for him. "Is she all right?" Daniel Moore still seemed uneasy about Eleanor Bennet, who had been drinking. "She's fine. She's asleep now," Charles King replied, surprised that someone as composed as Daniel Moore could also be swayed by this woman. "Eleanor Bennet, senior brother, you'd better stay away from her," Charles King coldly warned. Daniel Moore ignored Charles King and prepared to leave. "Senior brother, don't you find Eleanor Bennet strange? Her medical skills, even you can't discern which school they belong to." Charles King, knowing Daniel Moore wouldn't listen to him, tried to persuade him earnestly. "Perhaps she's not Eleanor Bennet at all." Daniel Moore couldn't explain it either, but recalling her drunken words earlier, it all made sense only if she wasn't Eleanor Bennet. "Senior brother, you should visit the palace less often in the future. Perhaps not meeting her would be the best choice." "How, have you also fallen for her?" He understood Charles King's cold demeanor all too well. Tonight's actions had said it all. "That's a question you shouldn't ask." Charles King swiftly disappeared into the night. Daniel Moore felt the chill in the air, his heart filled with worry. Chapter 24, The Wind of a Troubled Heart. Eleanor Bennet woke up to find herself lying on a warm bed. Her head still ached slightly, and she could only recall being drunk the night before. She faintly remembered dreaming about her deceased parents and perhaps even glimpsing Charles King's cold face. She knew she must have suffered too much because of him to the point where she hated him even in her dreams. Eleanor Bennet got out of bed, washed up, and left her room. Daniel Moore was waiting for her in the main hall. Seeing her still looking weary, he greeted her with a gentle smile. "Daniel." Eleanor Bennet approached him, assuming he must have been the one to bring her back to her room last night. "I've come to bid you farewell." "You're leaving the palace?" Eleanor Bennet felt a pang of sadness. She deeply admired his freedom. "Yes. Daniel Moore noticed the sorrow in her eyes. Take care. Eleanor Bennet had initially wanted to keep him at the Imperial Medical Institute, but knowing his free-spirited nature, she doubted he would agree. Otherwise, why would Charles King allow him to leave? Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore hesitated. Eleanor Bennet forced a smile. If you ever face difficulties, come find me at Harmony Hall. Daniel Moore understood the tangled web of emotions in this situation, a complexity that weighed on his heart. Daniel, would you be willing to return to the palace to help me? Eleanor Bennet hesitated for a moment before finally asking. Daniel Moore didn't answer immediately, remaining silent for a while. I was just asking. This deep palace is like a cage, imprisoning people. Who would willingly step inside? Eleanor Bennet knew she shouldn't have asked. She gazed at the towering palace walls, their golden tiles and red bricks filling her with a sense of helplessness. Daniel Moore detected the resignation in her tone. Could it be that her entry into the palace had another purpose? Eleanor Bennet, I'll agree to enter the palace for you, but I must first settle matters at Harmony Hall. Daniel Moore didn't believe Eleanor Bennet had ulterior motives for entering the palace. If she did, it must be because she had her own struggles. However, he knew this decision would inevitably cause friction between him and Charles King. Really? Eleanor Bennet grabbed Daniel Moore's sleeve in excitement, her eyes brimming with joy. Yes. Daniel Moore was resolute. Even if his bond with Charles King weakened, he would stand by her side. He didn't care what her intentions were or who she truly was, his heart belonged solely to her. As Eleanor Bennet watched Daniel Moore's retreating figure, she felt a warm breeze sweep through her heart, bringing her solace. She seemed to sense the emotions in Daniel Moore's eyes, but her feelings for him leaned more toward friendship than romantic love. Couldn't men and women share a deep, platonic friendship like Janice and William? Eleanor Bennet stood on the stone steps, lost in thought. The ginkgo tree in the courtyard had begun shedding its leaves, and a cold breeze swept through, rustling a few withered golden leaves. On the palace walls, flocks of white doves soared gracefully. Their carefree demeanor seemed to mock those trapped within the forbidden palace, oblivious to their own introspection. What are you thinking about? Charles King had been watching Eleanor Bennet's days for quite some time and finally couldn't hold back his words. Eleanor Bennet turned around and saw him, it was him. An ominous feeling suddenly rose in her heart. Your servant greets His Highness, the Duke of E. Eleanor Bennet bowed respectfully. Have you only now learned the proper etiquette of a subject? Charles King sneered coldly. Eleanor Bennet knew he was referring to her cold demeanor toward him at the Hall of Morning Flowers the other day. A trace of resentment surged within her. What brings your highness here? Is there something you wish to command? Eleanor Bennet lowered her head, avoiding a direct response. You're coming with me. Charles King grabbed Eleanor Bennet's hand and pulled her along. Your Highness, I still have many tasks to attend to. Eleanor Bennet, unsure of his intentions, felt a twinge of panic. My matters are more important. Charles King dragged Eleanor Bennet out of the Imperial Medical Institute. His pace was swift, and Eleanor Bennet struggled to keep up, practically being pulled along. Palace servants they passed stopped and bowed their heads, not daring to gossip. In their hearts, they all thought the same thing, Dr. Bennet must have offended the Duke of E, a man as fearsome as the god of death. Seeing the sympathetic glances from the onlookers, Eleanor Bennet sighed inwardly. If Charles King decided to punish her today, no one would dare to intervene. The two exited through the Radiant Sun Gate, where a spacious carriage awaited. Charles King climbed into the carriage without sparing a glance at the breathless Eleanor Bennet. Inside, he sat coldly, his gaze fixed on her hesitation. Still not getting in? Are you waiting for me to invite you? Charles King said as he toyed with the command token in his hand. It seems His Highness has fully recovered. You look well today, and your steps are steady. Eleanor Bennet sneered, casting a glance at Blood Shadow standing nearby. Today, she had a clear view of his face, sharp brows and bright eyes, yet exuding a cold aura. Truly, like master, like servant. You there. Help me. Eleanor Bennet commanded Blood Shadow. Blood Shadow hesitated, glancing at Charles King's expression, unsure whether to act. You truly are just a servant. Eleanor Bennet glared before stepping into the carriage herself. She chose the seat farthest from Charles King. At that moment, Charles King had his eyes closed, resting, allowing Eleanor Bennet a brief moment of peace. Gazing at the bustling scenery outside the window, she realized it had been a long time since she last returned to the Bennet residence. The carriage stopped in front of an official residence, and Charles King stepped out. Eleanor Bennet followed, intending to jump down, but to her surprise, Charles King lifted her down directly. Just then, another carriage pulled up at the entrance, and Edward King happened to witness the scene. A pang of tightness struck Edward King's chest as he wondered since when they had become so intimate. Eleanor Bennet, spotting Edward King from afar, couldn't help but feel puzzled. Why was he here too? What was this situation? What game was Charles King playing now? Eleanor Bennet raised her head to look at the plaque on the official residence. The three golden characters, Department of Internal Affairs, gleamed with authority. Ah, ninth brother is here too. I thought you'd be resting in the palace, Edward King remarked, his gaze fixed on Eleanor Bennet behind Charles King, unable to hide his jealousy. The Emperor has issued an imperial decree, how could I dare defy it? Charles King emphasized the words, imperial decree, but Edward King's expression remained composed. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but admire how, despite the tense atmosphere, they still managed to perform their act of brotherly affection. Your subject greets His Highness Prince Charles and His Highness Prince Edward, Eleanor Bennet said, not wanting to get caught up in their silent battle but realizing escape was unlikely. Dr. Bennet, it's been a while, Edward King said coldly, his gaze sharp as if doubting her true intentions. Third brother, ninth brother, let's go in. James King interrupted at the right moment, easing the taut atmosphere. Eleanor Bennet followed Charles King into a large prison. The walls, made of smooth, damp green bricks, exuded darkness, with only a small skylight on the roof letting in light. She looked at the man in the cell, his hair disheveled, his demeanor wild like a madman, and instinctively stepped back in fear. At that moment, a warm arm appeared behind her. Turning around, Eleanor Bennet met Edward King's smile. Don't be afraid, that's our eldest brother, Edward King whispered softly in her ear. Eleanor Bennet looked at the figure before her, not quite human yet not entirely beast-like, insane and foolish. So, this was David King. Dr. Bennet, please examine our eldest brother and see if his condition can be treated, Charles King said, coughing lightly as he stared intently at David King in the cell. Eleanor Bennet immediately understood that the request for treatment was merely an excuse. The true purpose was to determine whether David King's madness was real or feigned. What were Charles King and Edward King trying to achieve? Could it be that they both sought to bring down the Duke of Stirling? The Duke of Stirling had accompanied the Empress Dowager to pray for blessings and had yet to return to the capital. At this moment, it indeed seemed like the perfect opportunity to overthrow the Duke of Stirling. Eleanor Bennet, I will accompany you. Edward King thought Eleanor Bennet was afraid, so he stood beside her and spoke gently. Thank you, King Edward. Eleanor Bennet did not refuse, only gave Charles King a cold, expressionless glance. What, in his heart, was truly important? Power? The kingdom? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but smirk coldly, it certainly wasn't affection. If Edward King had any feelings, then Charles King likely had none. Eleanor Bennet entered the cell and saw David King charging towards her like a madman, mumbling incessantly. Edward King quickly pulled Eleanor Bennet aside as several guards restrained the frenzied David King. Eleanor Bennet stepped forward, looked into David King's eyes, and checked his pulse. After a while, she still couldn't determine the cause of David King's madness. "Eleanor Bennet, how is the Crown Prince?" Edward King asked as he stepped forward. "The Crown Prince has indeed gone mad." Eleanor Bennet continued to stare at David King, believing that no matter how well one acted, the eyes couldn't lie. Eleanor Bennet noticed a slight change in David King's eyes. "Can he be cured?" Charles King asked indifferently from outside. "I will do my utmost." Eleanor Bennet resolved to dive into these murky waters. If there was indeed something on David King that they wanted, perhaps it would become a card for her to leave the palace in the future. Eleanor Bennet glanced at David King with an emotionless face, suspecting he was feigning madness. It was undoubtedly a good way to preserve his life. She believed that Charles King and Edward King had also considered this possibility, otherwise, they wouldn't have let her intervene. Helping David King today might make it easier to approach him in the future. Eleanor Bennet followed them out of the prison and left the Ministry of Internal Affairs. "Eleanor Bennet, I will escort you back to the palace." Edward King stepped forward to offer, not wanting her to return with Charles King. "Third brother, I haven't had Dr. Bennet check my pulse today, so there's no need to trouble you with my return to the palace." Charles King, without any courtesy, pulled Eleanor Bennet into the carriage. "Third brother, the ninth fox has the Emperor's decree, and Eleanor Bennet is now his chief physician. We are powerless." Edward King understood the frustration in his heart. He always felt that Eleanor Bennet was not a simple person. If she affected their grand plans, she would have to be eliminated in the future. Chapter 25, Azure Water Hot Springs. Eleanor Bennet noticed the direction the carriage was heading. It didn't seem like the road back to the palace. She couldn't help but mutter to herself, "What is he up to this time? This isn't the road back to the palace." Eleanor Bennet cautiously spoke up. "I never said I was returning to the palace." Charles King replied, still focused on the document in his hand. "Stop the carriage, I want to go back to the palace." Eleanor Bennet could no longer hold back. Is David King truly mad? Charles King looked up at Eleanor Bennet, who appeared slightly angry, his eyes cold as if seeing through her thoughts. A prince pampered from birth, now reduced to a prisoner, how could he not go mad? Eleanor Bennet thought of David King's current situation and couldn't help but lament the unpredictability of life. "Woman, you'd better hide your little schemes. I am not Edward King and won't be fooled by your frail appearance." Charles King suddenly pulled Eleanor Bennet, who was sitting beside him, into his embrace. "Charles King, you." Eleanor Bennet blushed immediately, and before she could finish her sentence, her lips were covered by a cold sensation. She bit down hard, and the taste of blood spread in her mouth. "Woman, you are truly bold." Charles King released Eleanor Bennet, his eyes flashing with a hint of murderous intent. "Charles King, since you know I'm not weak, you should behave yourself in the future." Eleanor Bennet glared at him, warning him. "Woman, how about we make a deal?" Charles King suddenly changed the subject as if the previous incident had never happened. "I never make deals with devils." Eleanor Bennet sneered, wanting to live a few more years. "Don't you want to leave the palace?" Eleanor Bennet was shocked by Charles King's mysterious expression. "How did he know?" "You help me get the records from David King, and I'll let you escape." Charles King confidently revealed Eleanor Bennet's thoughts, looking smug. "If you can't get them, why assume I can?" Truthfully, even Eleanor Bennet wasn't sure. "Because you saved David King's life today." Charles King never believed David King was truly mad. It was merely a delaying tactic on his part. Eleanor Bennet looked at the man before her, he was truly cunning. Did she have any other choice? "All right, I agree to this deal." Eleanor Bennet understood what this meant. The thing in David King's possession was desired not only by Charles King. The Duke of Stirling and Edward King were also after it. By doing this, she was gambling with her life. The carriage had stopped, and Blood Shadow respectfully waited for his master to alight. Eleanor Bennet looked out the window. It was the same bamboo forest as before. She couldn't help but wonder why Charles King had brought her here. Blood Shadow, if anyone dares approach tonight, kill them without mercy. Charles King ordered coldly before entering the bamboo house. Eleanor Bennet hesitated outside. Was his cold ailment acting up again tonight? Or did the soul silkworm poison have a fixed time to act? Eleanor Bennet slowly stepped into the bamboo house, standing behind a screen, watching the steam rise from the hot water, feeling momentarily awkward. Charles King removed his outer robe, dressed only in innerwear, and stepped into the warm pool, closing his eyes to rest. Eleanor Bennet withdrew, sitting on a green stone outside, watching the sunset fade. The crescent moon began to appear. She watched the bamboo forest gradually sink into darkness, silent as a land of death. Master Bennet. Blood Shadow looked at Eleanor Bennet, who appeared melancholic, and couldn't help stepping forward to inquire. Eleanor Bennet paid him no attention, her gaze merely swept over the flickering lamp in the room. Tonight is the new moon, the day when the prince's cold poison flares up. Blood Shadow gazed at the silent night sky, his mood visibly downcast. Blood Shadow, how long have you been following him? Eleanor Bennet looked at Blood Shadow with concern, sensing his worry. 10 years. Blood Shadow replied. Then haven't you been by his side since he was just a child? Eleanor Bennet was astonished, he seemed to be only in his 20s. Since 10 years ago, on every new moon, the prince has endured the agony of cold energy corroding his bones. Back then, he was just a child. Without the protective martial arts taught by the old master of the Celestial Mountains, he might have perished long ago. Eleanor Bennet hadn't expected Charles King to have suffered for 10 years. She had once witnessed the torment he endured and the poison acted up, an excruciating pain beyond words. It was no wonder his personality had become so dark and twisted. The joys that should belong to a child were replaced by suffering in his world, shaping him into who he was. Today. Was it really his fault? Eleanor Bennet's compassion surged again. Perhaps this was why she always felt a pang of sorrow whenever she saw him. Master Bennet, you are the only one who can end the prince's suffering. I beg you, please save him. Blood Shadow suddenly knelt before Eleanor Bennet, pleading earnestly. Stand up. I will do my best. Charles King, as cold-hearted as he was, still had such loyal subordinates, truly rare. Even the cruelest people had some trace of goodness in their fate. Eleanor Bennet stepped into the bamboo house, moving past the screen. By now, much of the mist over the lake had cleared, and Charles King was still in the water. Seeing that he seemed fine, she sat down on the bed behind him to rest. Looking at his back, she couldn't help but sigh. Woman, come here. Charles King opened his eyes upon hearing her sigh. Eleanor Bennet hesitated slightly, then stepped cautiously toward the lake, standing warily behind him. She didn't want a repeat of last time, where she ended up tumbling into the water like a chicken. As she approached, she noticed his face was covered in water droplets, and his breathing was labored. Are you feeling unwell? Eleanor Bennet sensed a hint of unease. Charles King didn't answer her and kept his eyes closed. Suddenly, blood spurted from his mouth, and his entire body began sinking. Charles King. Eleanor Bennet realized the situation was critical. She quickly knelt by the lake and supported him. His body was icy cold, sending a shiver down her spine. She struggled to pull him ashore and hurriedly checked his pulse. The cold energy in his body was circulating rapidly, accompanied by chaotic internal energy. She hadn't detected this turbulent energy last time. Without further thought, Eleanor Bennet swiftly took out her acupuncture needles and began administering treatment to alleviate his pain. However, this time was not as smooth as before. Charles King's entire body convulsed, and his consciousness gradually faded. Charles King, you must hold on. Eleanor Bennet withdrew the needle, unable to hide her panic. How had he endured all these 10 years? Cold. So cold. Charles King mumbled softly, his body curling up. Eleanor Bennet glanced at the warm spring water before her, disregarding the propriety of men and women maintaining distance. She removed her outer cloak, embraced Charles King, and stepped into the pool with him. Charles King seemed to sense the warmth from Eleanor Bennet's body and clung to her tightly, as if trying to merge her into himself. Looking at the face that still captivated hearts, Eleanor Bennet noticed that the arrogance and coldness of the past had completely vanished. Her heart ached involuntarily, and the resentment she once held for him seemed to have dissolved long ago. What was the point of possessing the whole world if it couldn't dispel this bone-deep pain? Even boundless glory could not soothe this profound sorrow. For a moment, Eleanor Bennet found Charles King pitiful. Could his heart ever be filled with light? Her emotions became tangled, her thoughts swirling endlessly. She had no idea how much time had passed when Eleanor Bennet felt Charles King's body gradually relax. She checked his pulse, sensing the cold energy slowly dissipating. Looking up, she saw the first rays of dawn breaking through the sky. Eleanor Bennet helped Charles King out of the water, dried him off, and placed him on the bed. Then, she stepped behind the curtain to remove her soaked clothes. Wrapping herself in an outer robe, she approached the wardrobe by the bed to search for something. In the bottom compartment, she found a light blue undergarment and a simple, elegant dress. Recalling the last time she returned home drenched, she figured he must have deliberately left these for her. It turned out Charles King wasn't entirely heartless. In the upper compartment of the wardrobe, there were several men's outfits. Judging by the fine snow silk fabric, Eleanor Bennet knew they belonged to the man lying on the bed. However, she was unaware that Charles King had already woken up and was leaning against the bed, watching her with a dreamy gaze. "What are you thinking about, young lady?" Charles King spoke, knowing she had saved him again. Last night, he had intended to use his internal energy to counter the cold, but he had nearly lost control. "Huh. You're awake." Eleanor Bennet clutched her collar tightly, unaware that her delicate appearance had already caught Charles King's eye. She picked up the clean clothes that had fallen to the ground, pondering how to change into them. Charles King, noticing her flushed cheeks, couldn't help but feel drawn to her. "Come here, young lady." A rare gentleness flickered in Charles King's eyes, leaving Eleanor Bennet stunned, wondering if she was imagining things. She stepped back, intending to circle around the pool to avoid him. Sensing her intention, Charles King stood up and pulled Eleanor Bennet onto the bed. She wanted to resist, but remembering her lack of clothing underneath, she dared not move recklessly. She could only clutch her outer robe tightly. "Finally, you're being obedient, woman," Charles King murmured, planting a soft kiss on Eleanor Bennet's earlobe. His warm breath flustered her, making her entire body flush with heat. "Charles King, I should have killed you last night." Eleanor Bennet blamed herself for being too soft-hearted. Charles King ignored her words and leaned down to capture her cherry lips. He was addicted to her taste, the immersive feeling making him unable to control himself. The intense possessiveness within him overflowed, even her smile could only belong to him. Under his increasingly deep kiss, Eleanor Bennet found herself unable to resist, even harboring a vague sense of anticipation. Eleanor Bennet's outer garment had slipped halfway down, revealing her smooth, porcelain-like shoulders. The beauty of her chest became subtly apparent. Charles King's kiss gradually trailed down, pausing in the soft area between. Eleanor Bennet painfully snapped back to reality, realizing they were now completely exposed. She, embarrassed, pushed Charles King away, pulling her garment back up, and slapped him. "Charles King, you're shameless." Eleanor Bennet cried and scolded him, appearing as fragile as a flower in the rain. She was born in modern times and wasn't particularly conservative in her thinking. But matters of affection had to be with someone she loved, and she and Charles King were absolutely impossible. Is it so unpleasant to be my woman? Charles King didn't understand. Clearly, she had enjoyed his affection just moments ago, yet now she acted like this. Women, always saying one thing and thinking another. I've told you, I don't want this. If it happens again, I won't hold back. Eleanor Bennet wiped the tears from the corner of her eyes and hid behind the curtain to dress. Charles King sat cross-legged on the bed, beginning to adjust his internal energy. Eleanor Bennet tidied her clothes and stepped out of the bamboo house. Blood Shadow seemed to be waiting for her outside. Lady Bennet. His Highness ordered me to escort you back to the palace. Blood Shadow bowed in salute. Take me back to the Bennet residence. Eleanor Bennet, feeling very troubled, wanted to find a quiet place to calm down. Eleanor Bennet glanced out the carriage window towards the bamboo house. Thinking about the embarrassing scene with Charles King, her heart involuntarily beat faster. She had clearly responded to him earlier. Could she actually have feelings for him? Eleanor Bennet, you must be sleep-deprived and stressed. Even if there were no men left in the world, you couldn't possibly like him. Eleanor Bennet kept reminding herself, weakly holding her head, full of frustration. Chapter 26, The underlying current. Eleanor Bennet returned to the Bennet residence, leaving everyone in the household utterly astonished. Why would the young lady come back at this time? Moreover, she hadn't informed the residents beforehand. Housekeeper, where is my mother? Eleanor Bennet walked straight into the estate, her mind too preoccupied to think about anything else. The madam is at the Buddhist temple, reciting scriptures. The master has gone to court and has not yet returned. The housekeeper looked at Eleanor Bennet's weary face, his heart filled with doubt. I'll go to my room first. Don't disturb my mother. I will visit her later. Eleanor Bennet instructed before quickly heading to her chamber. Young lady, you've returned. Clara Young, upon seeing Eleanor Bennet, joyfully ran forward to greet her. Clara Young, how have you been lately? Eleanor Bennet asked with a faint smile. I've been well. How about you, young lady? Clara Young asked with concern, but Eleanor Bennet didn't reply. Clara Young, I want to take a bath. Eleanor Bennet leaned tiredly on her bed, closing her eyes. Clara Young complied and left, her heart filled with suspicion. What was wrong with the young lady today? She seemed troubled. Could something have happened in the palace? Young lady, the water is ready. Let me assist you in changing clothes. Clara Young returned after preparing everything, stepping forward to serve, but Eleanor Bennet declined. Clara Young, I'm a bit hungry. Go prepare breakfast. Also, tell the housekeeper to send someone to the palace and inform them I'm unwell. Clara Young grew even more suspicious but dared not ask further. She obeyed and left. Eleanor Bennet removed her garments and immersed herself in the warm, fragrant water. Her thoughts wandered to the ledger Charles King had mentioned. What exactly was recorded in it? Was it the reason David King feigned madness? David King being imprisoned, could it also be related to this? The intricacies of the palace were far more complex than she had imagined. Eleanor Bennet stood up and put on clean clothes. Suddenly, she noticed a few bruises on her chest, and memories of the hot spring incident resurfaced. A man like him, cold and unfeeling, viewed women as nothing more than playthings. For now, all she could do was hope that Charles King would keep his promise and one day release her from the palace. Thinking about leaving the palace, though she yearned for it, a faint sadness welled up inside her. Could she truly leave this place unscathed? After visiting Madame Bennet at the Buddhist temple, Eleanor Bennet returned to her chamber to rest. She had stayed up all night and now just wanted to sleep. Arthur Bennet returned home from court and, upon hearing the housekeeper report that Eleanor Bennet had called in sick, couldn't help but feel worried. Currently, Eleanor Bennet was serving in the Hall of Morning Flowers, and the king was far from a benevolent person. Could it be that Eleanor Bennet had encountered trouble and deliberately fled back? Thinking this, Arthur Bennet got off his sedan chair, his heart burning with anxiety, and headed straight to the study. "Steward, please invite the young lady to the study." Feeling increasingly uneasy, Arthur Bennet decided to call Eleanor Bennet to clarify matters. "Master, the young lady has instructed that she needs to rest and does not wish to be disturbed. She mentioned that she will come to greet you herself once she feels better." The steward thought of Eleanor Bennet now, her beauty captivating, a stark contrast to the little blonde girl from years ago. Now, he felt a bit apprehensive about this young lady. Hearing the steward's words, Arthur Bennet felt somewhat reassured. Perhaps Eleanor truly was just unwell and had returned home to recuperate. Eleanor Bennet woke up in the late afternoon. After finishing her dinner, she hurried to pay her respects to Arthur Bennet. She had no intention of telling him about David King, merely brushing over a few details before excusing herself. Returning to her chamber, Eleanor flipped through several medical books, searching for records about ancient poisons. This was an entirely unfamiliar field to her. Yet, suddenly, she felt a strong desire to cure Charles King, perhaps driven only by compassion for him. The Hall of Morning Flowers remained silent and cold. Blood Shadow leaned against the bed, half closing his eyes by the flickering light of the fire. "Is everything arranged?" Charles King asked, his voice cold, his face hidden in the shadows. "Everything is in order," Blood Shadow replied. "As long as Eleanor Bennet retrieves the records, Brian King will be eliminated." The sound of a cup shattering interrupted Blood Shadow's words. "My lord, what about Eleanor Bennet? How should we handle her?" Blood Shadow couldn't help but feel uneasy when mentioning Eleanor Bennet. "Her life is still useful. Assign someone to protect her. Starting tomorrow, many will want to take her life." Charles King sneered. Eleanor Bennet was right, one should never make deals with a devil, and he was indeed a devil. Unfortunately, despite knowing this, she still chose to proceed. In that case, she had only herself to blame. Blood Shadow understood the meaning behind Charles King's words. He had once thought Eleanor Bennet might be an exception, but now it seemed she was just another pawn. Once a pawn becomes expendable, its fate is sealed. Blood Shadow couldn't help but feel pity for Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor Bennet soon received an imperial decree summoning her to the palace to treat Brian King. Charles King was clearly eager to uncover the whereabouts of that item. Eleanor hurried to the palace, heading straight for the Hall of Morning Flowers. When it came to Charles King, she could not afford to let her guard down. Having chosen to deal with the devil, she had to be fully prepared for anything. "Recovering so quickly, are we?" Charles King remarked as Eleanor Bennet hurried in, his tone provocative. "Thanks to your concern, Your Highness." Eleanor did not bow, simply taking a seat on a nearby chair. "I have received the imperial decree to treat the crown prince," Eleanor said, cutting herself off and quietly sipping tea. "What are you trying to say?" Charles King knew her words carried hidden meaning. "If Your Highness and I have an agreement, I hope you will honor my conditions. Otherwise, I truly don't know how I can assist you." Eleanor observed Charles King's eyes grow colder, guessing that no one had ever dared set conditions for him before. "Let's hear it." Charles King suppressed his anger, curious to see what this woman was plotting. "The crown prince is currently in the dungeon, an unsuitable place for recovery. I humbly request Your Highness petition the Emperor to have him transferred to the Imperial Medical Institute under house arrest. That would make my work easier." Eleanor knew the dungeon was filled with spies, she feared she might be silenced before even obtaining the records. Charles King pondered the implications of Eleanor's words. He had underestimated this woman. Placing David King under house arrest at the Imperial Medical Institute would remove him from Charles's surveillance, as well as from the eyes of others. Could it be that Eleanor had already guessed he wouldn't keep his promise? "The prince doesn't need to rush to answer me, I have all the time to wait." Eleanor Bennet bowed and took her leave, stepping out of the hall. Eleanor Bennet, don't play tricks in front of me. Otherwise, I'll destroy the entire Bennet family in the blink of an eye. Charles King coldly agreed to Eleanor Bennet's request while issuing a stern warning. I do not doubt your Highness's capabilities. I only hope your Highness keeps his promise. Eleanor Bennet smiled lightly, her expression as delicate as misty rain, before swiftly departing from the Hall of Morning Flowers. Upon returning to the Imperial Medical Institute, she found Daniel Moore sipping tea in the hall. Seeing Eleanor Bennet enter, Daniel Moore gave her a subtle smile. Daniel! You're here. Eleanor Bennet's previously somber expression immediately brightened. Eleanor Bennet, I heard you were unwell. Daniel Moore looked at her, realizing his concerns had been excessive. Just a cold. I've already recovered. Eleanor Bennet invited him to sit, her tone soft. Eleanor Bennet, I've taken care of the matter at Harmony Hall. Daniel Moore had decided to assist her in entering the palace. Daniel, thank you. Eleanor Bennet understood well that the Emperor highly valued Daniel Moore. If he wished to enter the palace, everything would naturally go smoothly. Eleanor Bennet, there's no need for thanks between us in the future. Daniel Moore's timely assistance moved Eleanor deeply. In this palace filled with treachery, he was the only person she could trust. Daniel, do you know about Charles losing his mind? Eleanor Bennet felt it necessary to discuss her treatment plans with him. Yes, I've heard a little about it, Daniel Moore replied, a sudden sense of foreboding rising within him. The Emperor has issued an edict, ordering me to treat him. Eleanor Bennet, there's definitely a conspiracy here. You must be extremely cautious. Daniel, there truly is a conspiracy. And David King is only pretending to be insane. You know this, but how? Daniel Moore's face was filled with doubt and concern. Because Charles King wants the ledger that David King has. Eleanor Bennet said helplessly. Is it because of him? Daniel Moore clearly misunderstood the meaning behind Eleanor Bennet's words. Daniel, I have no other choice. I want to leave this place of turmoil. Eleanor Bennet knew he was overthinking, but she didn't want to explain further. Eleanor Bennet, I understand your struggles. Daniel Moore's trust provided Eleanor Bennet with great comfort. If she could successfully escape this chaotic place, she genuinely wished to roam the world with Daniel Moore. Eleanor Bennet soon received an imperial edict to place David King under house arrest at the Imperial Medical Institute, along with Alexander King's approval. Daniel Moore was smoothly appointed to work at the Imperial Medical Institute. Alexander King arranged for David King to stay in a quiet, secluded courtyard in the northern part of the institute. The area was guarded by palace guards, and no one except Eleanor Bennet was allowed to enter. Eleanor Bennet, without a doubt, became the only person who could interact with David King. Eleanor Bennet understood clearly that a struggle was gradually unfolding, and this time, she was at its very center. The success or failure of this battle revolved around that crucial ledger. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but wonder what exactly was recorded in it. Why were Charles King and Edward King so obsessed with it? What was their ultimate goal? If it targeted the Sceaux family, then she herself was already in grave danger. She couldn't rule out the possibility that the Duke of Stirling might become desperate and resort to silencing her permanently. And the Emperor, who was watching the Tigers fight from the sidelines, what was he waiting for? Eleanor Bennet didn't believe for a second that Alexander King was unaware of the motives behind all this. She deeply sensed that this was an intricate power struggle between multiple factions, and the greatest victor might not have revealed themselves yet. Chapter 27, Unveiling Clues. Eleanor Bennet decided to meet David King, the man feigning madness. She still vividly remembered the seemingly casual remark he made at the Chrysanthemum Festival, a phrase etched deeply in her memory. Perhaps those within the palace excelled most at disguise, and David King was no exception. However, his greed had led him to his current downfall. Eleanor Bennet walked in slowly, signaling the guards to retreat. She stared coldly at the man before her, his hair disheveled, his body covered in dirt, a far cry from the graceful figure he had been at the festival. "Your Highness, I pay my respects," Eleanor said, observing David King's act of foolishness, her eyes briefly revealing a flicker of astonishment, further solidifying her suspicions. "Your ability to feign madness is truly remarkable, Your Highness," Eleanor stated bluntly as she took a seat, exposing his act without hesitation. David King maintained his vacant, dazed demeanor, showing no reaction. "It seems Your Highness is beyond saving. Perhaps I should report to His Majesty and suggest sending you to the dungeon," Eleanor remarked as she stood, preparing to leave. "Eleanor Bennet, what is it that you truly want?" David King finally spoke, realizing he could no longer keep up the charade. "To save you," Eleanor replied coldly. "I do not wish to be saved by one of the 9 foxes," David King retorted with a sneer. Eleanor was taken aback. Despite his captivity, he seemed well informed about the outside world. She realized she had underestimated him. "The king's faction won't save you, but I am not one of his people," she replied. "What do you mean, Eleanor Bennet?" David King asked, suspicion evident in his expression. "Your Highness, you must understand your situation. Even if you continue to fake madness, how long can you delay the inevitable? Aren't you afraid that the hidden forces behind this will silence you permanently?" "Huh, Eleanor Bennet, I must admit I admire your courage and intelligence. But you underestimate me," David King laughed loudly. "If Your Highness is unafraid, it must mean you have a safeguard. But in this world, only the dead can keep secrets." "Surely, Your Highness understands this," Eleanor said, watching as his expression shifted from amusement to concern. He wasn't entirely unshaken. "You'll never get what you want from me, Eleanor Bennet." "Stop wasting your breath," David King declared. "Feigning madness is merely a means for Your Highness to protect yourself. Why not strike a deal with me instead?" she proposed. "And why should I trust you?" David King sneered, dismissing her as a naive girl. "I can help you disappear without a trace, freeing you from these schemes to live the rest of your life in peace. You may not trust me, but I believe Your Highness has no other way out." "Consider my offer," Eleanor said as she prepared to leave. She never expected David King to be easily swayed, so she wasn't in a hurry. "What do you want?" David King seemed somewhat intrigued. "The ledger in your hands," Eleanor Bennet said, and then left, leaving David King deep in thought. Eleanor Bennet had noticed his hesitation, betting on the survival instincts of human nature. She was certain that no matter which side obtained the ledger, the first person to be killed would undoubtedly be David King. Thus, the ledger had become his talisman, and he would never hand it over easily. Eleanor Bennet herself was not entirely confident in this transaction. After all, convincing David King to trust her was indeed a difficult task. Even after obtaining the ledger, would Charles King truly keep his promise? Even if he did, just knowing the secrets of the ledger alone would make it hard for her to avoid being hunted down. Leaving the palace would mean a life on the run, and she truly needed to carefully assess the feasibility of this plan. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel she had been too hasty and overly simplistic in her thinking. Eleanor Bennet. Daniel Moore noticed her silence and heavy thoughts, and he grew concerned for her. "Daniel, I'm fine." Eleanor Bennet gazed out at the gloomy sky through the window, listening to the howling northern wind. It was already winter. She sighed. It had been half a year since she arrived in this otherworld. Daniel Moore looked at Eleanor Bennet, who seemed burdened as she stood by the window. What he feared might truly be inevitable. "Servant greets Lady Bennet and Mr. Moore." At that moment, a eunuch entered and bowed before Eleanor Bennet and Daniel Moore. No need for such formalities. Eleanor Bennet assessed the visitor, finding him somewhat familiar. "Lady Bennet, this servant comes under the orders of His Highness King Edward to summon you to the palace to treat an illness." Eleanor Bennet recalled, this was Steward Chouet, the head eunuch of the Palace of Scenic Blossoms. "What happened to His Highness?" Eleanor Bennet asked curiously. Last night, His Highness drank with the fourth and fifth princes. Perhaps due to the joy of the occasion, he drank a bit too much. This morning, he woke feeling unwell. Thus, he specifically sent this servant to trouble Lady Bennet. Steward Shuey replied with a calm and humble demeanor. In that case, please wait a moment. I'll fetch my medical kit and accompany you immediately. Eleanor Bennet responded with a smile and then went inside to retrieve her kit. Eleanor Bennet, be careful. Daniel Moore cautioned her, worried. How timely this illness of King Edward's was. Just yesterday, David King had placed the Imperial Medical Institute under house arrest, and today, Edward fell ill. Don't worry. I can handle it. Eleanor Bennet reassured him with a smile before leaving the Imperial Medical Institute. Eleanor Bennet waited in the main hall of the Palace of Scenic Blossoms, awaiting King Edward's summons. In this cold weather, the outside world was barren, with only withered branches in sight. Yet, the Palace of Scenic Blossoms was lush and green. Inside the hall, several pots of vibrant greenery thrived, exuding vitality everywhere. From the arrangement of the scenery, it was easy to discern the temperament of its owner. The personality of Edward King was worlds apart from that of David King, completely opposite. Edward's gentle and elegant demeanor seemed to win people over more easily. However, beneath that refined and gentle exterior lay the innate coldness of a monarch. Master Bennet, you've waited long. His Highness invites you in. Eunuch Twee stepped out to deliver the message. Eleanor Bennet walked lightly into the inner chamber, passing a finely carved rosewood screen, and immediately noticed a bed made of Manhwa wood. The intricate carvings revealed it to be a top-tier piece. Edward King lay reclining on the bed, beside him a woman with cloud-like hair styled high, her beauty as radiant as jade. Judging by her attire and jewelry, she was likely a concubine. Among the royal family, harems were customary. Edward King was no exception, except for David King, who was currently poisoned. Fortunately for him, the poison rendered him harmless, otherwise, with his looks that even women envied, he might have captivated countless young hearts. Eleanor Bennet pays her respects to His Highness King Edward. Eleanor Bennet, realizing her breach of etiquette, quickly bowed in salute. Dr. Bennet, rise. Take a seat. Edward King did not look at Eleanor Bennet but instead smiled at the beauty beside him. Remaining composed, Eleanor Bennet seated herself to the side and began checking his pulse. Dr. Bennet, is His Highness's condition serious? The beauty spoke, though her eyes betrayed jealousy. Your Grace, His Highness merely has a mild cold and needs only rest to recover, Eleanor Bennet replied as she stood. She had already guessed that today's summons for a pulse check was merely a trap set by Edward King. Yet she still couldn't discern his purpose. Was it simply to flaunt his affection with a concubine? Millie Cyrus, leave us. Edward King's gaze suddenly darkened. Consort Cyrus, slightly frightened, bowed and retreated from the chamber. In the now spacious hall, only Eleanor Bennet and Edward King remained. The sweet fragrance lingering in the air heightened Eleanor Bennet's unease. Why are you helping the ninth prince? Edward King's eyes flickered with a trace of pain as he looked at Eleanor Bennet calmly. Your Highness, I do not understand your words. Eleanor Bennet, can you not see that Charles King is using you? Once you become a useless piece in his game, he will surely dispose of you. Edward King's gaze was filled with regret. He hadn't expected her to ultimately side with Charles King. Your Highness, Eleanor Bennet only follows orders and knows nothing beyond that. Eleanor Bennet firmly denied, uncertain if Edward King was merely acting in front of her. Very well. If you are uninvolved, then look out for yourself. I shall say no more. He will regret this decision. Eleanor Bennet understood his intentions. The emotions in his eyes might indeed be genuine. But to her, they held no value. Eleanor Bennet requested to leave, and as she did, she encountered Edward King stepping into the chamber. He gave her a cryptic smile, making her feel even more uneasy. Third brother, what are you planning? Edward King entered the inner chamber, taking a seat on a nearby armchair, observing Edward King lost in thought. Have someone keep an eye on Eleanor Bennet. The ninth prince is not the type to casually place an unrelated person near David King. Understood, third brother. Everything has been arranged. Fourth brother, once the records are obtained, kill David King. A murderous intent flashed across Edward King's face, carrying a faint coldness reminiscent of Charles King. And what about Eleanor Bennet? Edward King deliberately asked, wanting to know what place this woman truly held in Edward King's heart. Spare her life. Edward King hesitated, unable to harm her. He loved her deeply, to the point of soul exhaustion. Third brother, if she truly belongs to the 9 foxes, keeping her is a disaster waiting to happen. Edward King looked at his brother with concern. Fourth brother, even if I cannot have her heart, I must have her as a person. Edward King detected a murderous intent in his brother's words and warned him with a look. I understand, third brother. Edward King didn't want to ruin their brotherhood. Over a woman. After all, Eleanor Bennet, no matter how clever, was just a woman. Once she belonged to the third brother, what could she do? Eleanor Bennet left the Palace of Scenic Blossoms but didn't immediately return to the Imperial Medical Institute. Instead, she wandered in the Imperial Gardens, sensing danger creeping closer. Edward King was right, as soon as she became a discarded pawn, Charles King would silence her. Would Edward King do the same? Their nature was no different. Eleanor decided to carefully consider the matter of the ledger. If she couldn't have it, what would they do? She smiled slightly, a plan forming in her mind. Although this move was dangerous, it was undoubtedly a chance for survival in a dire situation. Chapter 28, A different kind of charm. Eleanor Bennet recalled a medicine her grandfather mentioned, which could render a person unconscious instantly without endangering their life, allowing them to awaken 3 days later. At the time, she thought it was just a joke and paid no mind. Now, it seemed useful. She wondered if this world had such an herb. Eleanor hurried back to the Imperial Medical Institute, drawing the herb from memory. Seeing her return safely, Daniel Moore sighed in relief. Eleanor, why are you drawing the blood crow herb? Daniel Moore recognized the herb under Eleanor's pen, known to cause instant paralysis upon contact with blood. You say it's the blood crow herb? Eleanor was delighted to find it existed, albeit under a different name. Yes, it paralyzes instantly upon contact with blood and is very rare. Daniel looked at Eleanor with suspicion. Daniel, do you know where to find it? I really need it. If he knew the name, he might know where to find it. 3 years ago, my master picked a branch. It's currently stored at Harmony Hall. Daniel, can you get it for me? Eleanor was slightly excited, grateful for his timely assistance. Eleanor, what do you need it for? Daniel asked curiously. To save someone. Eleanor replied firmly with just 2 words. All right, I'll go get it right away. Daniel didn't question further, suspecting it involved Charles King. Watching Daniel's figure disappear, Eleanor felt endless gratitude. If the world knew David King was dead, the coveted ledger would sink into oblivion. The cold night offered no sleep for Eleanor. She had a lead on the fake death potion, but convincing David King to trust her was a formidable challenge. Not to mention the difficulty of keeping it secret from the world. As she pondered, a shadow passed by, and she felt a chill at her neck. Master Bennet, don't be afraid. I just need a small favor from you. The man in black tightened his grip, causing Eleanor Bennet to feel a sharp pain. What do you want me to do? Despite her fear, Eleanor Bennet tried to remain calm. Take me to see David King, the man in black demanded. You want to rescue him? Eleanor Bennet glanced at him, trying to discern the face of the intruder. That's none of your concern. The man in black's face was completely covered, making it impossible to see his features. Eleanor Bennet had a hunch that this person wasn't here to rescue David King but to kill him. The one behind David King couldn't wait any longer to silence him. "All right, I'll take you." Eleanor Bennet, unsure of how to gain David King's trust, found this interference surprisingly convenient. The man in black underestimated Eleanor Bennet, thinking she was just a weak woman, surprised by her composure. "However, dressed like that, you'll be caught before you even meet David King." Eleanor Bennet smirked. "Humph, don't try anything." The man in black pressed a pressure point on Eleanor Bennet and sheathed his sword. "Under that cabinet, there's a set of servant clothes. Go change," Eleanor Bennet instructed. The man in black followed her instructions, found the clothes, and changed immediately. He then released Eleanor Bennet's pressure point and held a broken blade to her back. "Don't try anything, or you'll face the consequences, Master Bennet," he warned. "I need to get the medicine box," Eleanor Bennet said, slowly moving to grab the box from the table, slipping a teacup into her sleeve as well. The two left the room, moving towards the courtyard where David King was held, under the faint moonlight. The guards were startled to see them and drew their swords cautiously. "Who goes there?" one guard asked. "It's me," Eleanor Bennet replied. The man in black subtly increased the pressure on her waist as a warning. "Master Bennet, why are you still up at this hour?" the guard questioned suspiciously. "I suddenly remembered an ancient remedy that might cure the crown prince, so I wanted to try it immediately. If it works, it'll be easier for me to report my progress," she explained. "And who is he?" the guard inquired, eyeing the man behind Eleanor Bennet. "He's a new servant from the Imperial Medical Institute," Eleanor Bennet answered calmly. "Very well, Master Bennet, you may enter." The guard allowed her into the room. Eleanor Bennet slowly entered and saw David King sitting on the bed, still with his usual vacant expression. "You've seen him now, can you release me?" Eleanor Bennet glared at the man in black behind her, wondering what his next move would be. "Eleanor Bennet, who is he?" David King felt the intense killing intent directed at him and decided not to feign madness any longer. "Crown Prince, the Master always believes that only the dead can be trusted. Therefore, I was sent to escort you to the afterlife." The black-clad assassin finished speaking, and with a loud crash, Eleanor Bennet smashed the cup in her hand onto the ground. The shattering sound immediately alerted the guards outside. "Eleanor Bennet, I underestimated you." The assassin realized he had been exposed and swiftly thrust his sword toward David King. "Tonight, David King must die." Seeing the blade coming, Eleanor Bennet pushed David King aside, taking the assassin's strike herself. At that moment, the guards burst in and engaged in combat with the assassin. David King continued to feign madness, curling up on the bed and mumbling incoherently. Eleanor Bennet, struck in her right shoulder, collapsed unconscious. The guards rushed to the Imperial Medical Institute as the assassin found himself cornered. He had underestimated Eleanor Bennet, and his fate was self-inflicted. Laughing loudly, the assassin took his own life with his sword. Eleanor Bennet was brought to the Imperial Medical Institute for treatment. Experienced imperial physicians were summoned in a state of panic, as if sitting on pins and needles. Coincidentally, Dr. Moore was away from the palace at the time. Edward King, upon hearing the news, hurried over, only to witness the chaotic aftermath. A guard quickly stepped forward to report the incident. After hearing the account, Edward King grew deeply worried and hastened to Eleanor Bennet's quarters. "Your Highness, King Edward." The imperial physicians, upon seeing Edward King's anxious arrival, fearfully knelt to pay their respects. Edward King, deeply concerned for Eleanor Bennet, ignored them and strode directly into the room. Eleanor Bennet lay unconscious on the bed, her face pale, her chest covered in blood. "Eleanor Bennet." Edward King softly called out, but there was no response. Ever since she took on David King's matters, danger had constantly loomed over her. "All of you, get in here now." Edward King, his expression dark, shouted loudly. The imperial physicians timidly entered the room. If you cannot save Eleanor Bennet, prepare to be buried alongside her. Edward King's command was severe, though his tone betrayed his anguish. Your Highness, please calm down. We will do our utmost. However, our skills are limited, and it is imperative to summon Dr. Moore back to the palace immediately. The imperial physicians pleaded in fear. From the last time Edward King had protected Eleanor Bennet, they understood she was someone he deeply cared for. Now, it was even more evident. Send someone to find Mr. Moore immediately. Until Dr. Moore returns, you must keep Eleanor Bennet alive. If not, prepare for death. Edward King's voice grew colder, his usual gentle demeanor utterly gone. We obey. Your Highness, please step aside so we may stop Lord Bennet's bleeding. The imperial physicians trembled as they began their work. Edward King, gazing at Eleanor Bennet's faint breaths, reluctantly left the room. In the span of a tea break, Daniel Moore arrived in haste. His anxiety was palpable, he had only been away briefly, and yet Eleanor Bennet had encountered such a grave incident. Seeing Edward King standing in the courtyard, Daniel Moore didn't even pause to pay respects and rushed straight into Eleanor Bennet's room. Edward King, noticing his arrival, felt slightly more at ease. He placed his hopes on the disciple of the famed miracle doctor to save Eleanor Bennet. At this moment, James King also hurried over, seemingly with urgent news to report, forcing Edward King to unwillingly leave the Imperial Medical Institute. Meanwhile, in the Hall of Morning Flowers, the atmosphere remained cold and somber. Charles King sat on the bed, sleepless throughout the night. He had grasped every detail of the night's events. Hearing Blood Shadow's report, he couldn't help but feel a growing unease. How is she now? Charles King couldn't contain his worry for Eleanor Bennet. Mr. Moore is trying to save her, her fate is still uncertain, Blood Shadow replied, fully aware of who his master was asking about. Has the assassin's identity been confirmed? Charles King immediately crushed the ring in his hand, his expression as grim as the god of death. It's the Seven Kills sect. The same sect that attempted to assassinate you before. Blood Shadow answered. Order all the Shadow Guards to eliminate every remnant of the Seven Kills sect within a month. Charles King felt it was time to teach the House of Seven Kills a lesson. Blood Shadow withdrew after receiving the command, noting that the prince seemed particularly unsettled tonight. As the cold mist dissipated, the entire majestic palace was bathed in the morning sunlight. A scene full of vitality overshadowed the dense fog of the night. Daniel Moore watched Eleanor Bennet sleeping soundly, as fragile as a newborn. Having crossed the line between life and death last night, he saw his feelings more clearly. Without her, his life would also fade away. Daniel Moore gazed absent-mindedly at the person on the bed, his heart in turmoil. How is she? Charles King appeared behind him without him noticing. Daniel Moore smirked coldly, realizing that his internal strength had improved to the point where even he couldn't sense him. Haven't you seen for yourself? Daniel Moore reproached him slightly. If not for him, she wouldn't be in this situation. Brother, you've changed. Charles King sensed the resentment, wondering if their 10 years of brotherhood had to change because of Eleanor Bennet. Charles, let her go. Your vendetta has nothing to do with her. Daniel Moore knew he couldn't change him, only hoping he wouldn't drag Eleanor Bennet into the abyss. This lifetime, she can only belong to me. Whether she lives or dies is up to me. Charles King gently caressed Eleanor Bennet's snow-white cheek. Her appearance was a miracle. Daniel Moore left Eleanor Bennet's room, understanding Charles King too well, for what he desired, even if he couldn't have it, he wouldn't hesitate to destroy it. In his world, betrayal was not tolerated. Even as Charles King's elder brother, he was no exception. Eleanor Bennet's fate this lifetime was destined to be tragic. The only thing he could do was stay by her side and try to minimize the harm. He suddenly realized how powerless he truly was. Chapter 29, Potion-making. Eleanor Bennet awoke 3 days later. She opened her eyes, gazing at the familiar canopy, and sighed softly, a look of disappointment on her face. She had hoped to wake up in a pristine white hospital, which would mean she had completely left this dreadful place. Just escaped death and already looking gloomy, you truly are one of a kind. Charles King sat leisurely on a chair not far away, enjoying his tea. Why are you here? Eleanor Bennet was surprised that the first person she saw upon waking was him. Had he been here all along? Since when did her life or death concern him so much? Just wanted to see if you're still alive. Charles King said, holding on to the fireplace, wrapped in a thick fur coat. Eleanor Bennet looked out the window, where snow blanketed everything in white. No wonder he was dressed like a bear today. The thought made Eleanor Bennet chuckle. If he knew what she was thinking, he would surely strangle her. Charles King watched Eleanor Bennet sighing one moment and smiling the next, utterly perplexed. She truly was unique. After narrowly escaping death, she was first gloomy, then immediately cheerful. What on earth was going on in her mind? Eleanor Bennet felt her mouth dry and wanted to sit up to drink tea but was afraid of disturbing her wounds. She accidentally toppled towards the edge of the bed. Fortunately, a strong arm caught her just in time, moving so quickly that Eleanor Bennet was astonished. Are you tired of living, woman? Charles King frowned, but his tone revealed concern. I'm thirsty. Eleanor Bennet couldn't be bothered to argue with him and just looked longingly at the distant teacup. Charles King gently laid her down and went to pour tea for Eleanor Bennet. Eleanor Bennet intended to drink it herself, but Charles King unexpectedly fed her directly. She looked at Charles King curiously today, her eyes filled with confusion. It was unusual for him to treat a mere pawn so well, especially since there was no need for such behavior between them. Eleanor Bennet, you're awake. Daniel Moore was overjoyed to see Eleanor Bennet. But as soon as he saw Charles King, his expression darkened. When had he arrived? Recently, Eleanor Bennet's place had been quite lively. Edward King visited daily, while Charles King appeared when Daniel Moore was preparing medicine. The admiration in Edward King's eyes for Eleanor Bennet was evident, but Daniel Moore couldn't discern Charles King's feelings. What exactly did he feel for Eleanor Bennet? Perhaps even Charles King himself didn't understand. Daniel Moore glanced at Charles King with concern, feeling deeply uneasy. Senior brother, I'm leaving now. Charles King glanced at Eleanor Bennet on the bed and then left the room. Daniel. Eleanor Bennet smiled, temporarily ignoring Charles King's strange behavior today. How are you feeling? Daniel quickly stepped forward to check Eleanor Bennet's pulse. Daniel, I'm fine. These wounds will heal with rest. Eleanor Bennet reassured him. Seeing his worry. Eleanor Bennet, is that book really so important? Daniel Moore couldn't understand why Eleanor Bennet insisted on getting involved in this troublesome matter. Was she doing it for David King? Daniel, I really want to leave this place, but I can't ignore the Bennet family's welfare. This ledger might be the key to protecting the Bennet family at a critical moment. Eleanor Bennet expressed her thoughts. Daniel Moore didn't know what to say. He couldn't blame her for her actions, she truly had no other choice. Daniel, have you retrieved the blood crow grass? Yes, I've got it. Good. Help me find some rabbits and prepare a few more tools. Eleanor Bennet, your body hasn't recovered yet. What do you intend to do? Daniel Moore was surprised. Despite her severe injuries, she still wanted to act. I want to concoct medicine. The one behind David King has run out of patience. Although this assassination attempt failed, there will surely be another. I must seize the time to execute my plan. Eleanor Bennet had a thorough plan. This assassination attempt only accelerated her progress, and she believed David King would soon have to yield. Eleanor Bennet, no matter what, be careful. Daniel Moore was still worried about her injuries, but seeing her confident eyes, he could only support her silently. Don't worry. Eleanor Bennet tightly held Daniel Moore's hand, sending a warm feeling through his heart. Eleanor Bennet rested for a few days before starting to concoct medicine. She first ground the blood crow herb into powder, testing it in different doses on white rabbits. Eleanor Bennet knew well that to achieve the desired effect, the dosage had to be precise, otherwise, David King would surely die from poisoning. But for an expert like her, this task was as easy as turning her hand. 3 days later, Eleanor Bennet successfully created the pill she had been hoping for. Carefully, she placed the pill into an exquisite porcelain bottle and smiled in satisfaction. She needed to meet David King once more. "Lady, your spirit is truly remarkable," injured yet still refusing to rest. Charles King's sudden appearance startled Eleanor Bennet, prompting her to hurriedly stash the porcelain bottle into her medicine chest. "Why are you here?" Eleanor Bennet asked while tidying up the messy tools on her table, trying to maintain her composure. Charles King noticed her tension, glanced at the cluttered table, but found nothing suspicious. "What are you doing?" Charles King questioned, his eyes filled with doubt as he approached her. "Making medicine." Eleanor Bennet replied nervously, lowering her head to avoid his gaze. Charles King casually picked up a tool, intending to sniff it, but Eleanor Bennet quickly snatched it back. "Don't touch my things, you might get poisoned," Eleanor Bennet said as she moved the tool into the inner room. "You're making poison." Charles King, who had assumed she was preparing medicine for injuries, was surprised to find out she might also know how to make poison. "If I truly knew how to make poison, the first person I'd poison would be you," Eleanor Bennet denied immediately, not wanting things to escalate. "You truly hate me that much?" Charles King sat down casually, his charming eyes still radiating his undeniable handsomeness. "Of course. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have to suffer like this." Eleanor Bennet's face turned slightly red, her words tinged with resentment. "Eleanor Bennet, stop putting on an act in front of me. You shielded David King from that blade, there must be another motive behind it, right?" Eleanor Bennet fell silent, surprised at how sharp this nine-tailed fox truly was. He seemed to have sensed something. Even if there were a motive, it's useless. David King has indeed gone mad. "What do you mean by that?" Charles King hadn't expected her to admit it so openly. "That night, I observed David King. He had no idea how to evade the assassin's blade. If it wasn't sheer stupidity, then there's no other reason for him to willingly court death." Eleanor Bennet decided to fabricate a lie to dispel Charles King's suspicions. After hearing her, Charles King remained silent for a long time, making Eleanor Bennet increasingly uneasy. She wasn't sure if this small lie could deceive him. "Remember, Eleanor Bennet, don't play petty games. The lives of the entire Lowe family are in your hands. Since David King is no longer of any use, there's no need for you to remain at the Imperial Medical Institute." Watching Charles King's arrogant figure as he left, the tension in Eleanor Bennet's heart finally eased. Eleanor Bennet understood that Charles King had believed her lie. But for now, the most important thing was negotiating with David King. Otherwise, if he were sent back to the celestial prison again, there would be no more chances left. Eleanor Bennet carefully donned her cloak, took the poison she had prepared, and headed to David King's courtyard. The snow in the yard had melted, and the air carried a slight chill. Eleanor Bennet gently stroked her injured right arm, the horrifying scene from that night still vivid in her mind. "Lord Lowe, why are you here?" The guard outside the courtyard was astonished by her appearance at this hour. "The Grand Prince Simon will soon be sent back to the celestial prison. I'm here to perform the final treatment." Eleanor Bennet knew that Charles King would soon obtain the imperial decree, so her words weren't entirely false. The guards didn't suspect a thing and allowed Eleanor Bennet to enter. After all, This woman was no ordinary person. Just recalling King Edward's concern for her that night, they were certain she would hold the power over their master's fate in the future. Thus, they dared not offend her. Chapter 30, The Golden Cicada Shedding Its Shell. 1. David King looked at Eleanor Bennet, a hint of surprise flashing in his eyes. She had appeared again. Remembering how she had risked her life to shield him from a blade that night, he couldn't help but see her in a new light. Not only her intentions but even her aura made men wary. How could a woman like her willingly be a pawn of the nine-tailed fox? The Grand Prince is truly ungrateful. I risked my life to save you, yet there hasn't been a single word of thanks. Eleanor Bennet sneered coldly, seating herself without permission. Lord Bennet, your selfless act is etched in my heart. David King chuckled, his eyes gleaming with cunning. Unfortunately, I can only save your highness once. Eleanor Bennet looked at David King with a regretful expression. What do you mean by that? David King pressed for an answer. I've reported to His Majesty that the Grand Prince's madness is incurable. I'm afraid it won't be long before you're sent back to the celestial prison. Eleanor Bennet spoke nonchalantly, as if the matter had nothing to do with her. Eleanor Bennet, you, David King was so enraged he wanted to strangle her, but he quickly regained his composure. Tell me your plan. David King knew that if he returned to the celestial prison, even if he wasn't assassinated, Alexander King would hold him accountable. He had no way out now. This medicine is specially prepared for your highness. Once consumed, it will make you appear truly dead. Once the news of your death spreads, the danger will naturally dissipate. 3 days later, the effects will wear off, and your highness will come back to life. Eleanor Bennet took out a delicate porcelain bottle and placed it in front of David King. How can I trust you? David King's face showed suspicion. If this was a trick, wouldn't it be a loss beyond recovery? Your highness may not believe it, but this is your only chance. Eleanor Bennet stood up, preparing to leave. All right, then what are the conditions? David King put away the porcelain bottle, deciding to take a gamble. I only need your records. Eleanor Bennet turned to look at the fallen David King. He was now like an arrow already drawn on the bowstring, with no way to retreat. I will make a deal with you. If it could truly save a life, how could he refuse? The prince only needs to quietly bring this medicine back to the prison and take it after a few days. I will arrange everything properly to assist your highness. After giving her instructions, Eleanor Bennet left the room. As she walked, Eleanor Bennet pondered. The plan was set, now, it was only a matter of waiting for the imperial decree to convict David King. She believed David King would not disappoint her. Looking into the distance, Eleanor Bennet saw a few sparrows startled into flight, causing some unmelted snowflakes to fall, sparkling beautifully in the air. Eleanor Bennet, so here you are. I've been looking for you everywhere. Edward King had intended to visit Eleanor Bennet in her room, but she was nowhere to be found. Unexpectedly, he saw her standing absent-mindedly in the courtyard. Your Highness King Edward, I greet you. Eleanor Bennet quickly bowed in respect. Eleanor Bennet, you are injured, there's no need for formalities. Edward King stepped forward to help Eleanor Bennet, gazing at her with deep affection. Thank you for your concern, your highness. Eleanor Bennet lowered her head, avoiding his gaze. Eleanor Bennet, I will not let you face danger again. I have already petitioned my father to send David King back to the prison. If he is beyond saving, he must still be dealt with according to the law. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel suspicious. She had assumed Charles King would be the one to report this matter, why was it Edward King instead? Could it be that the two brothers shared the same thoughts? Eleanor Bennet absolutely did not believe this was a coincidence. She suspected it was a deliberate arrangement by the cunning Charles King. Could it be that even by Edward King's side, Charles King had planted his trusted aides? Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but admire Charles King's meticulousness and thoroughness. Such a man was truly terrifying. "Thank you for your kindness, Your Highness King Edward." Eleanor Bennet bowed in gratitude. After all, her goal had been achieved. As for the struggle for the throne between the two brothers, she had no interest in it. "Eleanor Bennet, I have sent someone to bring you a ginseng root to help with your recovery. You are still gravely injured, so please refrain from moving around unnecessarily." Edward King held Eleanor Bennet's soft hand, determined not to let go no matter what. "Thank you, Your Highness." Faced with Edward King's deep affection, Eleanor Bennet felt a bit flustered. She had no such intentions, yet he seemed unwilling to give up. Confronted with this complicated affection, Eleanor Bennet truly did not know how to handle it. "Eleanor Bennet, it's time to take your medicine." Daniel Moore stood at a distance holding the medicine, but upon seeing Edward King, he suddenly became flustered. "Oh!" Daniel Moore's appearance brought Eleanor Bennet a great sense of relief. "Your Grace, I shall take my leave now." Eleanor Bennet took a deep breath of the cold air, and the pressure in her heart instantly dissipated. She smiled at Daniel Moore before returning to her room. Edward King watched the graceful figure walking away, that charming smile naturally caught his eye, stirring jealousy in his heart. Could it be that the one she cared about was him? "Eleanor Bennet, I truly cannot bear to destroy you, but I can destroy the one you love. One day, you will realize my feelings." Edward King stormed off in anger, planting the seeds of future hatred. Chapter 31, The Golden Cicada Sheds Its Shell. 2. Daniel Moore watched Eleanor Bennet take medicine with some concern. Where had she been just now? What was her relationship with Edward King? Daniel Moore recalled Edward King holding Eleanor Bennet's soft hand earlier, and a pang of jealousy rose in his heart. "Daniel, David King has agreed to the deal with me." Eleanor Bennet seemed very excited, completely unaware of Daniel Moore's current feelings. "Oh. So you went to see him just now?" Daniel Moore realized he had been overthinking. He should now focus all his efforts on helping Eleanor Bennet overcome this obstacle. "Yes, the assassin did me a great favor, otherwise, David King would never have given in so easily." "Eleanor Bennet, after you get the ledger, what do you plan to do? Having it with you might bring trouble." Daniel Moore frowned, knowing she had no intention of handing the ledger over to Charles King. "Daniel, honestly, I don't know. I can only take it one step at a time. If this ledger contains too many shocking secrets that could harm the people, perhaps I'll give it to the Emperor." Eleanor Bennet believed Alexander King was still a wise ruler, and it would be better to give it to him than to those vying for power. Daniel Moore did not doubt Eleanor Bennet's intentions. Her wisdom and strategy in court, apart from Charles King, were unmatched. Giving it to the Emperor was indeed the best solution. However, in this power-hungry court, could the Emperor truly be fair and just? He still worried about Eleanor Bennet's safety. "Daniel, I suspect many people are already watching me, so I'll need your help in the future." Eleanor Bennet felt fortunate to have a confidant she could entrust with her life. "Eleanor Bennet, I will do everything in my power." Daniel Moore was delighted by her trust, asking for nothing more in life. Eleanor Bennet laid out her entire plan. Daniel Moore admired her meticulous thinking even more. If she were a man, she would undoubtedly be a brilliant general. This time, even a cunning fox like Charles King might be within her calculations. The intelligence of a woman should never be underestimated. This strategy of shedding the cicada's shell had misled everyone, further eliminating suspicion from Eleanor Bennet at this moment. Her thoughtfulness, medical skills, intelligence, and courage made him respect her even more. At this moment, he realized that his previous worries seemed somewhat unnecessary. She was fully capable of protecting herself and was by no means just an ordinary noblewoman. As the night deepened, the cold wind, like a drunken man, battered the window bars. It wove through the desolate palace, sometimes howling madly, sometimes panting wearily. Bare branches trembled in the cold wind, swaying uneasily, while the moon seemed to hide behind the clouds, afraid of the cold. Trees rustled, and the gale swept the branches and leaves, dancing like the claws of a demon. Inside the Hall of Morning Flowers, the warmth from the incense burner seemed unable to repel the cold air seeping in. The person on the bed furrowed their brows slightly and casually waved a hand. A plume of white smoke immediately surged from the burner, obscuring even the flickering flames. A eunuch hurriedly approached under the pale moonlight. Seeing the man, he quickly bowed low in reverence. "Is everything arranged?" Charles King propped his chin with his hand and asked lazily, yet his words carried undiminished authority. "Reporting to your highness, everything has been carried out according to your orders. At this moment, His Majesty is reviewing King Edward's memorial." "Good, very good. From today onward, keep a close watch on Eleanor Bennet's every move." Charles King smiled meaningfully, as if he were the ultimate victor. "Your servant obeys." The eunuch, trembling, cast a fearful glance at the person on the bed before hastily retreating. Blood shadow. At Charles King's call, a shadowy figure swiftly emerged. "My lord." Blood Shadow appeared like a ghost, making the already eerily quiet Hall of Morning Flowers even more unsettling. "What's the status of Shadow's mission?" "Reporting, my lord, the Seven Kills sect has been eradicated. Shadow is now fully focused on hunting down the few remaining disciples. I want the sect master of the Seven Kills sect alive." Charles King's breathing seemed a little uneven, though his emotions remained unreadable. "Understood, my lord." "Any movements from Mount Cloud Top?" Illusionary Shadow reports that the Empress Dowager has completed 33 rounds of rituals. It seems she will return to court soon. Order Illusionary Shadow to continue monitoring. Charles King speculated that the Soares family could no longer hold back, further proving the value of David King's ledger. Blood Shadow, assign someone to keep an eye on Daniel Moore. Assist him if necessary. Charles King smirked with satisfaction. He believed Eleanor Bennet wouldn't have taken that blade for no reason, and this was the perfect chance to uncover her true intentions. If she was an enemy, he would make sure she paid dearly. Eleanor Bennet was still too optimistic about what was to come. She did not yet understand Charles King. Years of navigating the treacherous palace had hardened him, he was cold and unfeeling. In his eyes, trust did not exist, only manipulation. That was the sole rule of a power-hungry tyrant. Without adhering to this rule, how could he have gained the authority to laugh at the world from his position today? His heart was not set on supreme power but on the cause of his past suffering and delusion. Everyone would pay the price. What he endured, he would reclaim 100-fold. As the final night of winter receded, the fiery horizon gradually lit up the billowing clouds. After months of recuperation, Alexander King finally appeared on the imperial throne in the Hall of Righteous Proclamation, gazing down arrogantly at the court officials. The Bryn dynasty, once in turmoil, seemed to be welcoming a new calm, much like the passing winter. Chapter 32, The Clark Dynasty. The court officials, seeing Alexander King suddenly attend the court, couldn't help but secretly whisper among themselves. Could it be that something major is about to happen today? Arthur Bennet stood expressionless, respectfully clasping his hands, yet his heart was filled with worry for Eleanor Bennet. Ever since learning that Eleanor Bennet had cured David King's madness, he had felt that the matter was far from simple. Why would Eleanor Bennet shield David King from a blade? What exactly was she planning in her heart? Arthur Bennet couldn't deny that since Eleanor Bennet fell into the water and lost her memory, his daughter seemed to have undergone a complete transformation. Whether in her thoughts or personality, she had become more composed and stable. Yet he could no longer fathom her intentions. Everything seemed to have spiraled out of his control. Though the incident in Camden Province had long been resolved, His Majesty had delayed addressing David King's case. The fact that David King went mad and was subsequently assassinated at this time, what could it signify? The more Arthur Bennet pondered, the more anxious he became, fearing that if Eleanor Bennet made a mistake, it would implicate the entire Bennet family. In the court hall, a heavy silence prevailed, with everyone speculating about what might occur today. "Father, the Crown Prince embezzled relief funds meant for Camden Province and even instructed the provincial governor to bribe assassins to kill the imperial envoy. The evidence is now clear. I, your son, have followed your decree to investigate this matter and have come today to seek your directive." Edward King broke the silence in the Grand Hall. The court officials collectively exhaled in relief. It turned out to be about the Camden Province issue after all. "If this matter has been thoroughly investigated, then handle it according to the law. Effective immediately, strip the Crown Prince David King of his title, exile him to White Tomb, and forbid his burial in the royal mausoleum after death. Confiscate all his assets and transfer them to the state treasury. His concubines, children, and servants are to be sent to the borderlands as slaves for generations. His mother, Consort Young, who has shown poor virtue and failed to raise her son properly, will be stripped of her title and confined to the cold palace from this day forward. Any officials involved in this case will be executed by beheading outside the Meridian Gate in 3 days, with their female relatives and servants conscripted as official courtesans, without any chance of pardon." Alexander King's voice exuded the authority and iciness of a sovereign. A cold wind swept through the hall, causing the court officials to shudder. The Crown Prince's faction had been completely eradicated, leaving the officials to ponder who might inherit the empire in the future. One wrong move could cost not only their lives but also the survival of their entire families. Long live the wise emperor! The officials trembled as they knelt to receive the decree. "Your Majesty, the imperial examination is approaching. This year, 10 scholars have advanced to the final round. May I humbly ask if your Majesty wishes to personally set the examination topic this year?" Minister Page tactfully dispelled the heavy atmosphere in the court. "Recruiting talent through the imperial examination is the foundation of the empire. However, I am aging and lack the energy for such tasks. Let this year's final examination topic be entrusted to King Edward." Alexander King turned to Edward King, his gaze filled with approval. "Your son." Edward King was momentarily taken aback. "Edward is dedicated to investigating the case in Camden Province, earning the people's favor, and I'm very pleased. Now that King Edward's residence is nearly complete, I grant him 1,000 acres of fertile land, 100 servants, and 100 sets of jewels and porcelain from the palace to celebrate." As the decree was announced, everyone in the hall looked at Edward King in astonishment. They wondered why the emperor, who had always been indifferent to King Edward, was suddenly acting differently today. "Thank you, Father, for your generous grace, but the Camden Province case was not my achievement alone, and I dare not take all the credit." Edward King knelt to express his gratitude, maintaining a humble demeanor. Having merit without arrogance, Edward's virtues are indeed commendable. Today, I appoint the 4th Prince, Edward King, as the virtuous king, and the 5th Prince, Richard King, as king. The Ministry of Internal Affairs should find suitable locations outside the palace to build residences for the 2 princes. Alexander King knew what Edward King desired and had intended to confer titles upon his 2 sons, seizing this opportunity to do so. Edward King and Richard King were naturally surprised, quickly accepting the decree with gratitude. The courtiers all shouted in unison, "Long live the wise emperor!" In the hall, everyone except Charles King, who remained expressionless and silent, wore looks of surprise and speculation. Could it be that the emperor truly intended to make King Edward the crown prince? After all, King David was chronically ill and had a rather sinister disposition, making him an unsuitable choice for succession. The balance of power in the court seemed to shift in an instant. Amidst the courtiers' expressions of gratitude, Alexander King contentedly dismissed the court. Lords, Edward King stood in the hall, his face showing a hint of pride as he glanced at Charles King beside him. "Next month, I will move my residence outside the palace. I hope you will grace my new home with your presence at the banquet. Charles King covered his mouth with a handkerchief, coughing lightly without revealing any emotion. Congratulations to King Edward on your new residence. At this moment, no one dared to voice any dissent, as King Edward now had the support of King David and Richard King, further strengthening his power. We will surely attend. Understanding the shifting winds and adapting to the times is the rule for survival in the political arena. Edward King was very satisfied, feeling he was one step closer to the throne. Charles King merely let out a cold laugh before striding out of the Hall of Righteous Proclamation. Arthur Bennet paid special attention to King today, noticing that he seemed uninterested in the Emperor's rewards. Arthur Bennet couldn't help but wonder if this was a trap set by the Emperor or if there was another scheme at play. Lord Bennet. Edward King slowly approached Arthur Bennet. I greet King Edward. Arthur Bennet replied with a smile. Next month, Lord Bennet must come to my residence for a few drinks. With such joyous news, of course, I must have a few drinks. Arthur Bennet understood that Edward King had more than just a simple invitation in mind. Please also bring Dr. Bennet along. Edward King's voice carried a hint of embarrassment. Arthur Bennet understood that he indeed had feelings for Eleanor Bennet. I will certainly bring my daughter to pay her respects. Arthur Bennet replied, already formulating a plan in his mind. Arthur Bennet left the palace and exited through Main Clark Gate. He hurriedly got into his carriage and returned home. Upon arriving, he immediately sent someone to the palace to convey a message, asking Eleanor Bennet to visit whenever she had time. Although the matter with David King had settled, he still felt uneasy. He needed to find out the truth. Edward King, along with Edward King and Richard King, left the palace and headed towards their new residence in the western part of the city. The three rode horses, followed by dozens of guards, quickly arriving in front of a magnificent mansion. 3 large red doors inlaid with gold, several towering pillars stood imposingly. On either side of the entrance were 2 mythical creatures, both exquisitely sculpted. Edward King looked up, noticing the 3 golden letters, King Edward Residence, emphasizing royal majesty. Third brother, this time the Ministry of Internal Affairs has done quite an efficient job, remarked Prince Edward King, standing behind Edward King, seemingly pleased. Let's go inside and take a look. Edward King said, stepping up the stone steps into the residence. An official, appearing to be in charge of the project, immediately stepped forward to pay his respects. Your Highness, King Edward, Prince David, Your Highness King. Who are you? Edward King asked, looking at his official attire, guessing he was an official from the Ministry of Works. I am an external official of the Ministry of Works, in charge of constructing the King Edward residence this time. Minister Du, you've worked hard. I'm just here to take a look today. Edward King gestured for him to rise. Billy Butcher, not daring to delay, slowly followed behind. Entering the residence from the gate, there was a floral hall, with both sides paved with warm goose-colored stone. In front of the hall was a white jade screen engraved with a spring bamboo and wealth painting. Walking through a narrow path behind the screen, the space suddenly opened up. The lawn pavilion water pavilion, with railings carved from jade, was mesmerizingly beautiful and exquisitely detailed. Passing through the winding corridor led to the main hall. The main hall was several feet wide, with a set of sandalwood carved Grand Master's chairs and a triangular table in the center. Various colorful plants were arranged around the hall. Several ancient paintings by famous artists hung on the walls. Third brother, your residence is even more luxurious than the Palace of Scenic Blossoms. Richard King approached, admiringly observing the authentic craftsmanship. Fifth brother, when your residence is completed, I will also gift you a few items. Edward King, sitting in the main seat, was in high spirits. Minister Du, your hard work is commendable. I will certainly request a reward for you. Edward King addressed Billy Butcher, who stood upright after bowing. This man was indeed clever, knowing well the prince's fondness for elegant things. Thank you, Your Highness King Edward. Billy Butcher bowed in gratitude and tactfully withdrew. Third brother, don't you find father acting strangely today? Edward King, sitting beside him, looked troubled and contemplative. Fourth brother, tell me what you think. Edward King also sensed something unusual. In the past, no matter how much we contributed to the kingdom, father would at most offer a few words of praise, some trinkets or palace attendance. But today, bestowing titles, granting residences and lands, this is the first time. Edward King glanced at Edward King, choosing not to elaborate further. Fourth brother makes a valid point. I also feel father was somewhat excessive today. Richard King had returned from viewing the painting to his seat. Currently, father is aging, yet he hasn't mentioned appointing a crown prince. The court officials are increasingly opportunistic, merely standing by and waiting. All eligible princes have been granted titles, making father's intentions harder to discern. Edward King analyzed the current situation, which seemed clear but held underlying risks. Currently, the elder has fallen from power, but the influence of the Sou family remains unaffected. For a long time, the emperor has wanted to eliminate the external influence of the Sou family, but he hasn't found an excuse yet. Now that the records have completely disappeared, I suspect he wants to cultivate us to counter the power of the Duke of Stirling. Edward King seemed to see through Alexander King's overly ostentatious display today. If what third brother says is true, doesn't that mean the emperor wants to use us and has no intention of passing the throne to us? Does he only want to protect the ninth prince? Richard King, with a hint of anger, questioned why they were treated so harshly despite being princes of the same bloodline. Fifth brother, as long as our brotherhood is strong enough, what can the emperor do to us in the future? If the emperor gives us the opportunity to build our power, we should make the most of it. Edward King smirked coldly, not the type to be easily manipulated. The fourth person, I entrust you with the matters of the elder statesmen in the court. After today's events, those old men will certainly take action. The fifth person, I leave the imperial guards and the generals to you. You already have a good relationship with them, just control the military power of the imperial guard in the capital, and even father will have to concede. Edward King and Richard King both nodded, as they would never dare to neglect their duty to Edward King. Third brother, we received news from Mount Cloud Top yesterday that the Empress Dowager will soon return to the palace. Edward King said. Humph, she finally couldn't hold back any longer. Edward King clenched his fists in anger, his bright eyes filled with hatred. The absence of a member of the Sou family in the palace is certainly a blow to them. Edward King understood the source of his rage. The matter with David King is settled, but the accounts must be thoroughly investigated. Edward King didn't believe everything could be forgotten. As long as there was a glimmer of hope, he wouldn't give up. Until the last moment, the winner couldn't be determined. Eleanor Bennet stood in the courtyard of the Imperial Medical Institute, feeling relieved as she watched David King being led away by the guards. With just a simple exchange of glances, Eleanor Bennet knew David King was ready. Then, she entered Daniel Moore's room, where he was focused on mixing medicinal ingredients, completely unaware of Eleanor Bennet's presence. Daniel! Eleanor Bennet called, looking at his busy figure. You're here, make yourself comfortable, I'll be done soon. Daniel Moore said as he added some powder into a porcelain bottle. Daniel, what is this? Eleanor Bennet asked curiously. Mi Hun San. Daniel Moore replied. A sedative? Eleanor Bennet knew that in ancient times, there were substances similar to anesthetics, but she didn't expect Daniel Moore to know how to make them. Yes. If we want to successfully take David King's body away, we can't do it without this. Daniel Moore said with a smile. Looks like you have a plan. I'll wait here for good news from you. Eleanor Bennet originally intended to ask about the details of rescuing David King, but seeing his confidence, she decided not to. Eleanor Bennet, do you really think David King will hand over the accounts to us? Daniel Moore still felt a bit worried. It was known that Charles King had been searching for this item for a long time without any leads. Surely, David King wouldn't be so easy to deal with. I'm not entirely sure, I just know he doesn't want to die. As long as he wants to live, he will have to comply. Eleanor Bennet had also considered Daniel Moore's concerns. However, there was no other option at the moment. Is Lord Bennet here? At that moment, a shrill voice sounded from outside. Eleanor Bennet, please come in. Eleanor Bennet stepped outside and saw a eunuch. His Highness King requests your presence, the eunuch said. What does the prince require? Eleanor Bennet felt a bit anxious at the thought of David King. The prince hasn't specified, but you'll find out if you come with us. The eunuch, speaking coldly, seemed reluctant to say more. Eleanor Bennet, I'll accompany you. At this moment, Daniel Moore also stepped out, noticing Eleanor Bennet's troubled expression and moved forward to assist. Mr. Moore, the prince only invited Master Bennet, please don't make it difficult for me. The eunuch hurriedly stopped Daniel Moore from accompanying them. Daniel, perhaps he needs me for a medical consultation, you have more important matters to attend to. Eleanor Bennet signaled with her eyes, indicating to Daniel Moore not to miss significant tasks over minor issues. Daniel Moore could only watch silently as Eleanor Bennet left, though he suspected what she might be thinking. Did David King truly not understand Eleanor Bennet's intentions? Why did he always feel that things were not as simple as they seemed? Since receiving his master's order to descend the mountain to assist David King, he had never seen any of David King's plans fail. Would this time be an exception? The eunuch led Eleanor Bennet not towards the Hall of Morning Flowers, but to the Imperial Gardens. Seeing the different direction, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but feel suspicious. Eunuch, aren't we supposed to go to the Hall of Morning Flowers? Eleanor Bennet slowed her pace, her instincts telling her something was amiss. Master Bennet, the prince is waiting in the Imperial Gardens, the eunuch replied calmly. The prince usually dislikes the cold, why would he be in the Imperial Gardens in this weather? Eleanor Bennet felt something was wrong and decided to turn back. Master Bennet, we're almost there. The eunuch unexpectedly grabbed Eleanor Bennet with astonishing agility. Who are you? Eleanor Bennet realized this person knew martial arts. Was there some conspiracy? Master Bennet, it is the Emperor who summons you. Please follow me. Hearing it was the Emperor, Eleanor Bennet grew even more suspicious. Why would the Emperor impersonate David King to summon her? Eleanor Bennet followed the eunuch to the knock-ho in the Imperial Gardens, where a royal barge was docked. A few eunuchs stood waiting by the lake. Your Majesty, Lord Bennet has arrived, the eunuch reported into the royal barge. Eleanor Bennet looked at the shadowy figure behind the silk curtain. Could it really be the Emperor? She glanced around, wondering why eunuch Liam was not present. Let her in. Eleanor Bennet recognized the voice as that of Alexander King. She slowly stepped onto the royal barge, standing outside the silk curtain. At that moment, the eunuchs simultaneously boarded the boat, and the royal barge quickly moved to the center of the lake. Eleanor Bennet observed them, they didn't seem like the usual servants from the Hall of Heavenly Purity. Moreover, their steps were light and skillful, clearly indicating they were martial arts experts. It was evident that Alexander King did not want anyone to know about this meeting. Eleanor Bennet, come in. Alexander King suddenly spoke, inviting Eleanor Bennet inside. She slowly entered and saw Alexander King in casual attire, sitting on the throne with no attendants around. I greet your Majesty. Eleanor Bennet knelt and saluted, occasionally glancing at Alexander King. How is your injury? Alexander King looked at Eleanor Bennet kneeling on the ground but did not instruct her to stand. Thank you for your concern, your Majesty. My injury is stable, Eleanor Bennet replied calmly, lightly touching her still bandaged right arm. I meet you here today because I want to hear an honest word from you. I understand you are an exceptionally intelligent woman, but even the wise can't avoid occasional cunning. I admire talent and do not wish to see you go astray in the future. Your Majesty's concern is appreciated, but I am just an ordinary woman, perhaps slightly bolder. As for the matter your Majesty mentioned, please clarify. Eleanor Bennet did not shy away from Alexander King's cold gaze. Today, he set up this situation merely to probe. Does he suspect any dealings between her and David King? I just want to know why you shielded David King from an assassin's knife. You clearly knew he was a criminal awaiting execution, yet you risked your life to protect him. Alexander King spoke directly, addressing the issue without hesitation. Your Majesty, while the Crown Prince may be a criminal awaiting execution to you, to me, he is merely a patient. A good doctor is like a caring parent, risking my life to save him was simply instinct. Eleanor Bennet, after hearing Alexander King's words, felt less tense. So, this was his only suspicion. Alexander King looked at Eleanor Bennet for a long time and then suddenly laughed heartily. His previously aggressive demeanor vanished instantly. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but marvel at the unpredictable nature of the Emperor's mind. The daughter raised by Arthur Bennet is indeed remarkable. Alexander King praised with a hint of mystery. Escort Lord Bennet ashore, he ordered the attendants outside. Eleanor Bennet saluted and took her leave, stepping off the flower boat. She realized that the boat had stopped in the middle of the lake, with the red walls of the palace visible in the distance. If Alexander King wanted to take her life today, he could have easily thrown her into the lake, and no one would have known. People would merely think it was the doing of the evil David King, without suspecting the brave and wise emperor. Eleanor Bennet stood on the small boat, gazing at the flower boat in the middle of the lake. Suddenly, she realized that Alexander King's terror far surpassed that of David King. From now on, she must be even more cautious. The palace's atmosphere was too murky. Once Eleanor Bennet stepped into it, there was no way out. An unfathomable emperor, a cold and sinister David King, an outwardly refined and courteous Edward King, and the cunning Arthur Bennet, all of it gave her a headache. Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but blame herself. Even after being reborn, she couldn't find peace. Chapter 33, Words of Governance. The small boat swayed and quickly reached the shore. Eleanor Bennet sighed in relief, her tense heart finally relaxing a little. Lord Bennet has arrived, please watch your step. Eleanor Bennet heard the eunuch who had escorted her earlier reminding her. Thank you, sir. Eleanor Bennet stepped off the boat and returned the courtesy. She cast a glance at the flower boat faintly visible in the middle of the lake before turning to leave. Today, she had clearly felt the killing intent emanating from Alexander King. Yet why he didn't make a move, she couldn't understand. She wasn't naive enough to believe he had been convinced by her lies. Miss. Be careful. Lost in thought, Eleanor Bennet didn't notice the path ahead and bumped into a firm chest. Why is it you? Eleanor Bennet looked up, meeting the icy gaze of Charles King. She tried to step back, but he held her tightly in his arms, leaving her unable to move. Where have you come from? Charles King glanced toward the Jade Lake, his tone as if he already knew everything. I was just strolling by the lake, Eleanor Bennet replied, not intending to recount what had just happened. Oh. The wind by the lake is so strong, weren't you afraid of falling into the water? Charles King's seemingly casual remark sent a ripple through Eleanor Bennet's heart. And you? With such strong winds, can your body handle it? Eleanor Bennet retorted without backing down. She was well aware that today's encounter was anything but coincidental. You're getting bolder by the day. Charles King slowly leaned closer, his hand tightening around her waist. Charles King, what are you trying to do? Eleanor Bennet glared at him angrily, her heart racing, though a blush crept across her face. Woman, you should know. Charles King sneered, leaning in to kiss Eleanor Bennet. The familiar sweet taste intoxicated him once again. Eleanor Bennet felt the possessiveness in his kiss, yet a faint sense of euphoria arose within her. Charles King, can't you survive without taking advantage of me? Eleanor Bennet attempted to bite him again, but this time she failed. Charles King released her, amused by the sight of the furious woman before him. When angered, she was even more radiant and captivating. Woman, come with me. Charles King glanced toward the distant corridor with a cold smile. Where are you taking me? Eleanor Bennet followed his gaze but saw nothing. Even so, she felt as though someone was watching them intently. Charles King didn't answer, just pulled her towards the Radiant Sun Gate. Eleanor Bennet knew she couldn't change his mind, so she obediently followed. They quickly reached the Radiant Sun Gate, where Blood Shadow had a carriage ready and waiting. Master. Blood Shadow saw Eleanor Bennet and seemed unsurprised. Charles King got into the carriage and turned to help Eleanor Bennet. She was momentarily stunned by his unexpected gesture but then handed him her arm. This cold-faced man showed a surprising gentleness. At that moment, Edward King returned to the palace and, seeing Charles King and Eleanor Bennet in the carriage, couldn't help but feel jealous. Fourth brother, have someone follow them. Edward King instructed the person beside him, then rode into the Radiant Sun Gate. Edward King watched the carriage disappear and signaled the guards to follow. Then he also rode after Edward King. The relationship between Eleanor Bennet and the nine-tailed fox was certainly not simple. If not for the warning from the third brother, he would have eliminated the threat long ago. Eleanor Bennet noticed the carriage's direction seemed different from that of the bamboo forest hot springs. Today was not a new moon, so Charles King's poison wouldn't act up. What was his plan in taking her out? Eleanor Bennet glanced at Charles King, who was resting with his eyes closed, feeling anxious. Master, someone is following us. Blood Shadow reported from outside. Oh. Charles King opened his eyes but didn't move. Little girl, someone is very concerned about you. Charles King lazily leaned back with a hand warmer. How do you know they're following me? Why not you? Eleanor Bennet retorted. When it came to attracting attention, he was definitely more noticeable than she was. Little girl, it seems I need to make you mine soon to stop others from thinking about you. Charles King's voice was teasing, but Eleanor Bennet ignored him, trying to peer through the curtain to see who was following. No need to look, it's Edward King's men. Charles King seemed to know the answer already. Edward King. Eleanor Bennet recalled that the figure riding into the Radiant Sun Gate did resemble him. He seems quite interested in you. Charles King smiled at Eleanor Bennet, his rare smile as beautiful as blooming peach blossoms. Eleanor Bennet didn't believe Edward King had someone follow her out of personal interest. She had anticipated that many would be paying attention to her lately. Could Edward King have figured out her intentions? Eleanor Bennet felt immense pressure. Acting under the watchful eyes of so many schemers was not easy. The carriage headed east, turned onto a large road, and then stopped. Through the curtain, Eleanor Bennet saw a magnificent mansion. She stepped down from the carriage and looked up to see the words. Prince Charles's residence, powerfully engraved on a golden plaque. Standing before the grand mansion, Eleanor Bennet couldn't help but be amazed. What did you bring me here for? Eleanor Bennet never expected Charles King to bring her to his new estate. To show you what might need improvement, so you won't complain when you move in later. Charles King said as he walked into the estate, leaving Eleanor Bennet stunned. What? Move in. Eleanor Bennet stood there, mouth agape, completely dumbfounded. Lady Bennet. Come inside. Blood Shadow, seeing Eleanor Bennet frozen in place, couldn't help but chuckle. Oh. Eleanor Bennet exhaled deeply. With your cold demeanor, even if this estate were gilded in gold, I wouldn't care. She stepped into the estate, the astonishment still evident on her face. Charles King, did you move the entire imperial gardens here? Eleanor Bennet gazed at the jade-carved corridors and the magnificent, luxurious pavilions, seemingly even more splendid than the imperial gardens. do you like it? Charles King stood on the tower, gazing absent-mindedly at the lake. Squandering the people's labor and resources. Eleanor Bennet remarked with a hint of disdain, showing no sign of being impressed. So what? As long as I like it. A trace of contempt flashed in Charles King's eyes. Charles King, do you realize that just because of your liking, the people of the kingdom have to exhaust all their efforts? Here, a single tree or blade of grass might represent a year's livelihood for them. Your extravagant wastefulness, have you ever considered the well-being of the people? The sages said, the ruler is the boat, and the people are the water. Water can carry the boat, but it can also overturn it. As a king, everything must prioritize the foundation, and the foundation of a nation is its people. The people's basic needs like food and clothing are paramount, and all matters related to them should adhere to fundamental principles. If you don't even understand this, how can you govern the kingdom? Even if you gain the world, how long can you hold on to it? Eleanor Bennet's cold expression exuded an air of authority. Charles King was momentarily taken aback as he stared at the woman before him. Her discourse on governance, where did it come from? Every word and sentence was a truth, making even him feel inadequate. Women from Bryn didn't read books, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to articulate such thoughts. She seemed more and more extraordinary to him, like an unsolvable mystery. Eleanor Bennet noticed Charles King's silence and realized she had said too much. Why did she always feel the urge to argue? This time, Charles King would surely grow even more suspicious of her identity. Thinking of Bryn, they wouldn't know anything about Taizong or Wei Zheng. What she said today was undoubtedly ahead of its time. Who taught you such words? A flicker of doubt indeed appeared in Charles King's eyes. I accidentally came across them in the palace library, Eleanor Bennet reluctantly lied. Arthur Bennet certainly knows how to educate his daughter, David King sneered coldly, leaving the tower and heading toward the distant mansion. Eleanor Bennet could sense the hidden meaning in his words. After all, this wasn't the first time he had doubted her. Let him think whatever he wants. Blood Shadow, escort Lady Bennet back to the palace. Eleanor Bennet was surprised that David King let her off so easily. She took one last look at the opulent building. These royals truly lived in excess, and she feared that Bryn's century-old legacy couldn't withstand such extravagance. Sitting in the carriage, Eleanor Bennet carefully pondered today's events. First, there was the secret summons from Alexander King, followed by the chance encounter by the lake with David King. Surely, these two events were closely linked. David King must have stationed someone to watch her, which is why her being taken to Jade Lake was quickly exposed. But why did he come to Jade Lake? Could it be to rescue her? This reason seemed too far-fetched, even Eleanor Bennet found it hard to believe. His rescuing her was simply too unbelievable. Blood Shadow, take me back to the Bennet residence. Eleanor Bennet smiled, instructing Blood Shadow outside the carriage. She guessed that Daniel would make a move in the coming days, so she decided to feign illness and stay home. After all, too many eyes in the palace were on her, making it unsuitable for her to act. The carriage soon arrived at the gates of the Bennet residence. Eleanor Bennet stepped down and thanked Blood Shadow, leaving him awkwardly unsure of how to respond. She smiled and walked away, paying him no further attention. Miss, you're finally back. A servant at the door, upon seeing Eleanor Bennet, rushed inside to inform the steward. Watching the servant's hurried departure, Eleanor Bennet wondered if her father was also looking for her. Miss, the master sent someone to the palace with a message early today. Why have you only returned now? The steward asked anxiously, confirming that Arthur Bennet was indeed searching for her. Is mother at the residence? Eleanor Bennet suddenly remembered her wound hadn't fully healed and thought it best not to worry Lady Bennet. Madam went to the Golden Flower Temple to pray yesterday and hasn't returned yet. The master is currently in the study. The steward replied. All right, inform my father that I'll pay my respects later. Also, send someone to the Imperial Medical Institute, telling them I'm ill and need a few days' leave. After giving her instructions, Eleanor Bennet returned to her room.